This video is one of a 4-part mini-series by author, speaker, and research analyst Ray Yungen. This was recorded in Vancouver, BC, Canada, and Ray is joined by his friends Al and Nancy, and they're discussing the topic of the Aquarian Conspiracy and what this book by Marilyn Ferguson means and entails in light of the New Age occult explosion that is canvassing the globe in our age. There are other videos in this series which we encourage you to watch so that you get a full grasp and understanding of what Ray is discussing. And please note that Ray is not promoting the occult techniques of meditation, yoga, energy healing, Reiki, and many other occult practices. Ray is actually examining them in light of the Word of God, the Bible, and giving a sober warning throughout.
Yeah, I began researching this movement back in mid-1980s, about 1984. And this book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, was very popular at the time, and it was showing how various spiritual approaches that had been somewhat obscure or novel before were becoming mainstream. Now, the woman that wrote this book was named Marilyn Ferguson, and I want to share some information on how this came about. Marilyn Ferguson got into transcendental meditation in the 1970s through her brother. She had, I think, migraine headaches. Okay. And her brother had been involved with transcendental meditation, or TM as it's called, and it suggested maybe this would help her her headaches. So she got into it, and she became spiritually attuned to New Age ideologies through it. So she began this in 1975. She began publishing this monthly newsletter, or twice monthly newsletter, called Brain Mind Bulletin. And this was on, as she put it, states of consciousness, meditation, and related subjects. So she was putting out a booklet, or a newsletter on New Age spirituality and how it was impacting. And she said that rapidly growing numbers of people were exploring, new territory. As I traveled around the country lecturing and covering conferences, I found these pioneers everywhere. And the new perspectives were being put to work. The social activism of the 1960s and the consciousness revolution of the early 1970s seemed to be moving toward a historic synthesis. Social transformation resulting from personal transformation, change from the inside out. So what she was saying is people who wanted the activists, social activists from the 1960s, instead of merely going out and protesting, were starting to combine this with Eastern type mysticism. She said that it suddenly struck me that in their sharing of strategies, their linkage and their recognition of each other by subtle signals, the participants were not merely cooperating with one another, they were in collusion. This movement was a conspiracy. And then she goes on to say that, the word conspiracy normally has negative associations. But she said this conspiracy was a positive one. It was a benign one. She said, conspire in its literal sense means to breathe together. It is an intimate joining. And she chose the word Aquarian because, this was connected with the astrological age of Aquarius, that we were entering a millennium of love and light. And she, basically, this Aquarian Conspiracy was what many would call, the New Age movement. And that's what I began to look at. I began to study this movement. And she says the conspirators are linked, made kindred by their inner discoveries. So over the last 31 years, I've watched this movement go from being relatively obscure to being very, very pervasive in Western society. Good example is when I first started to research in 1984, there were very few books on this available to the general public. I remember when one would go into the mall, chain mall bookstores, B. Dalton was one, you would only find 5 shelves devoted to this type of thing. And then another 10, 15 years later, in the late 90s, there was a bookstore chain called Borders, and it had actually mushroomed to 65 shelves. So it went from 5 shelves to 65 shelves just in, 10, 12 years or so. So that is an incredible amount of time. And also, it was the nature of where these books were. Like, for instance, this is being, the audience should, or the people listening should know that this is being filmed in Canada, Vancouver, British Columbia. And a few days ago, remember you went, or no, it was Eddie and I went to the Metrotown Mall, which is the big mall here in Vancouver. And we went to Chapters, which is the national bookstore chain of Canada. And of course there was a New Age section, and you had books like on Wicca, witchcraft, psychic powers, that type of thing. That was about 17 shelves. But there was another another section called well-being, and that was 25 shelves, somewhat bigger than the New Age section. And in that area were mostly New Age books. That was the real New Age section, was this section devoted to what's called well-being. That's where you found The Secret, that's where you found Louise Hay's books. I mean, mainstream New Age spirituality was represented in this section called well-being. There was even books by the former Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who now goes by the name of Osho, and there was like practically a whole shelf just devoted to him. And this is where people go to find answers to their problems. Incidentally, the Christian section was 20 shelves. So the well-being section was, 5 shelves larger than the Christian section. So you put the New Age section and this section together, it came to, something like 43 shelves, I believe it was, 42, 43 shelves. So we're looking at a really large interest here still, 35 years after Marilyn and Ferguson wrote this book. And there's individuals who can back this up. This is a book called The Making of the New Spirituality, The Eclipse of the Western Religious Tradition by James A. Herrick. And he makes it clear that this is not just a conspiracy theory. Neo-paganism, the paranormal, astrology, nature religion, holistic thinking, healing, New Age, new spirituality. A massive shift in Western religious attitudes has taken place, almost without our noticing it. And that's why we're making this film here, because we want to make it clear to people that this is something they can't ignore. The Judeo-Christian tradition of Western culture has slowly but steadily been eclipsed by a new way of viewing spirituality. And you can really see that. I'm glad he said Western. You can really see that in Europe. Last summer I was in Great Britain, Ireland, and Germany. And Western Europe is known for being secular, right? Church attendance is very low, and most people that follow the culture there talk about how secular Western Europe is. Now, it may be secular, but it is not void of spirituality. Again, I went to, you can really find out the popularity of these things by what's called the law of the market, supply and demand. So I went to the national chain bookstores in, Great Britain and Ireland. went to Dublin and Birmingham, and the national bookstore chain there is called Waterstone. It's the equivalent of what Borders was here, and you know, Barnes and Noble still is. So I went to, well, I was staying in the Cork area, and I went to the one there, and that, you know, was the same as in the U.S. So I went to the one in Dublin, and they had some 40-some shelves that said Body, Mind, Spirit. That's what New Age spirituality is known as in England and Ireland, is Body, Mind, Spirit. So they had 40-some shelves devoted to that. Well, actually, there was a section called the Occult, then there was Astrology, and then it said, there were a big area that said Body, Mind, Spirit. Then there was a big area that was the equivalent of, you know, self-help or well-being that I just mentioned, and, you know, chapters. And again, that was predominantly New Age books. And then there was like alternative health, a lot of which was connected with what's called energy healing. And then there was Eastern religion, you know, Hinduism, Buddhism, that type of thing. So altogether, there were 80 shelves at the Waterstone bookstore in Dublin. But the one that really was pervasive was the one in Birmingham, which is England's second largest city. It was like a really high rise. I think there was 4 or 5 stories or so. They had an elevator. It was so big. And again, you know, Body, Mind, Spirit. And then they had one called Spiritual Living. And that's where you found the same kind of books. In fact, they had Madame Blavatsky's A Secret Doctrine in Spiritual Living. And then again, you know, self-help and alternative medicine. And actually there were 88 shelves, or no, 100 shelves devoted to New Age spirituality there. And then in Dusseldorf, Germany, I went to the bookstore there, and that's where there were 88 shelves devoted to, you know, New Age spirituality. Books on Christianity hardly existed in the one in Dusseldorf. The overriding spiritual view in that one in Dusseldorf was what Marilyn Ferguson was talking about, the Aquarian Conspiracy, you know, metaphysics. So it seems, you know, and anyone can check this out. You know, this is something that can be verified. All you have to do is email Waterstone Books in Birmingham or Dublin, or if you know someone, if you speak German or know someone who speaks German, you can find the one in central Dusseldorf, and they would verify that, you know, oh, by the way, in Dusseldorf, it's not called New Age, it's called the esoteric, which is another term for the occult, you know, the esoteric. And, you know, totally, like I said, 88 shelves devoted to these subjects. 35 years after Marilyn Ferguson wrote her book. So, you know, this is something that can be verified, you know. But so we were talking about secular. How can a society be secular and still be permeated with basically something that most people would perceive as being religious, right? Well, you've heard the term spiritual but not religious. Well, there's actually a book by that name, Spiritual but Not Religious, see? This is written by Professor Understanding Unchurched America. And this is, you know, written about America, but this could also be, you know, written about any Western country, you know, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain. And in it, he says that that what he calls seeker spirituality is gradually altering the American religious landscape. He says over the past decade, bookstores have emerged as the most important centers of unchurched spirituality. And he says that these large national chains such as Borders and Barnes and Noble function as virtual synagogues of spiritual instruction. These stores have large sections labeled Bible, Christianity, and Judaica that offer publications on those subjects. Alongside them now are even larger sections devoted to books on Eastern religions, New Age religion, and self-help philosophies. He says the boundaries of American religion are clearly being redrawn. The suppliers of unchurched spirituality are no longer seen as addressing a small group of kooks who just don't fit into respectable American society. Moreover, this new eclecticism also shapes the personal piety of many who attend our nation's established churches. So not only are large millions and millions of people spiritual but not religious, but even the ones that are attending churches, churchgoers, are being impacted by the spiritual climate because of the popularity of this subject. Well, here's another one, John Bradshaw. This was something that was more apparent back in the late 80s, early 90s. John Bradshaw was on public television. By the way, public television has been a major promoter of what we're talking about, New Age spirituality. And this was one of the first individuals that really fit this description. Whenever they have pledge drives, they always have kind of experts in certain fields. And back in the late 80s, early 90s, Bradshaw was on public television quite often. Most likely when they had pledge drives. So I don't know, I'm not familiar, I don't think Canada has public television, but they would show, he would dominate entire evenings. And then others came after him. Deepak Chopra was on public television. One of the most prominent ones was a man named Wayne Dyer, who we'll get into later. And I think he was on 12 years on public television with their pledge drives. But anyhow, this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. John Bradshaw wrote a book called Bradshaw on the Family. And that was, his specialty was family dynamics. And this book became very, very popular in psychology circles and counseling circles. Remember when John Bradshaw spoke, in my area there, huge numbers of people came to see him. He was considered a major expert on the family. And again, a lot of his book was on, things that were benign, or actually within the realm of society's traditional views of things. Nothing that would be considered offbeat or unusual. But then at the very end, he had roadmap for discovering your true self, spiritual awakening. And that's where he started to talk about meditation, the codependence is a spiritual problem. And that we need to get higher consciousness. Higher consciousness constitutes the realm of our true self. And that when you're in alpha brainwave consciousness, that's meditation, you have these powers available to you. And he talks about a friend of his that can stick 12-inch knitting needles through his hands and then heal the wounds. And he says that there were also ancient traditions supporting a higher power through expanded consciousness, through the use of meditation. And he says at these highest moments of consciousness, we are one with the universe. And he says beyond the ego, there is no separation. We are all one. And he goes on all throughout this, to find our true self, we have to transcend our ordinary ego consciousness. And this constitutes our godlikeness. Again, we are all God. Our true self is our God self. He says this is crucial. If you don't understand this, you're going to be stuck in your dysfunctional family mode. And he says as one advances in meditating, a new facility emerges. And it only emerges in silence. And he says as one advances into the silence, this faculty becomes more and more available. And this is the power of experiencing God. Mysticism. Spiritual disciplines. Spiritual awakening. Expanded consciousness. So in essence, what what I've been talking about here in this session is Western society, not just American, but all over the Western world, over the last 30 years, has been transformed by these kind of practices and these kind of promotions. And that is why at the mall there, at the major mall in Vancouver, British Columbia, the section called Well-Being is saturated with books that promote meditation and that man is divine. And this is the Aquarian Conspiracy.